Hello folks, and welcome back to the channel. So you may have noticed over the last couple of months we've been playing quite a bit of Warhammer Skirmish, a loose set of skirmish rules tucked in the back of the 2000 Warhammer Fantasy 6th edition rulebook and expanded upon in a few other places after that, which we'll talk about later in the video. Anyway, some viewers have asked us how we think Warhammer Skirmish differs from Mordheim, which is another skirmish game from 20-some years ago, also set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and whether we think one rule set is better than the other. Well, I wouldn't say that either is necessarily the superior rule set, though Mordheim is a self-contained game, while Warhammer Skirmish is bundled in with the larger Warhammer Rank and Plank system. Both of these skirmish games are actually very similar in a lot of ways, sharing much of the same DNA. For instance, they're both I go, you go games with an almost identical turn sequence. They both use a to-hit chart and a wound chart to determine the target numbers for combat die rolls. And of course, both games take place in a vast fantasy world filled with elves, orcs, dwarves, skaven, beastmen, and the like. Despite those similarities, however, these are very different games in terms of how you build your forces, where the games take place, what kind of scenarios you play, and what each side is trying to achieve. And there's also some granular differences in the rules for things like weapons, special abilities, and critical hit effects. Anyway, just for the heck of it, I thought we'd talk a little about both Mordheim and Warhammer Skirmish, delve into some of those differences, and discuss what kind of games each rule set sort of lends itself to. Let's start with Mordheim, since it was published maybe a year earlier than Warhammer Skirmish, way back in 1999. Mordheim was released as a box specialist game with virtually everything you needed to play, the rules, the miniatures, the terrain, even whippy measuring sticks included in the box, though the figures in the terrain needed to be assembled. Here's the January 2000 issue of White Dwarf, Ho Ho Ho, which not only has a cardstock Mordheim reference sheet bound into it, but also features 25 pages of Mordheim content in the form of an integrated town crier section. So yeah, around the turn of the millennium, Mordheim was a pretty big deal for Games Workshop. So Mordheim is a campaign-style warband-based skirmish miniatures game of horror and adventure created by Thomas Pirinen with a little help from Rick Priestley and Alessio Cavatore, and it mostly takes place within the comet-struck city of Mordheim. However, in the months and years that followed the game's initial release, GW published numerous supplements and articles that built upon the original rulebook, adding new warbands and hired swords, and expanding the setting beyond Mordheim into the wider world. You could even play Mordheim in Lustria if you wanted to. For the sake of simplicity, however, we're just going to look at the original core rulebook today and how it compares to Warhammer Skirmish, and not worry too much about the vast library of articles and supplements. So Mordheim takes place roughly 500 years before the reign of Karl Franz in the main Warhammer Fantasy setting. So while Mordheim and Warhammer Skirmish both exist in the same fictional universe, they're about 5 centuries apart in the timeline. In Mordheim, players recruit a warband from a particular faction. In the core rulebook, these factions include human mercenaries, either Reichlanders, Middenheimers, or Marienburgers. Then you have the Cult of the Possessed, the Witch Hunters, the Sisters of Sigmar, the Undead, and the Skaven. Then over time, GW would add several new factions like Amazons, Pit Fighters, Dwarf Treasure Hunters, and Beastmen. Each Mordheim player picks a faction and then builds and equips a warband from it with a leader, perhaps a couple of heroes, and probably a bunch of henchmen with available troop options varying from faction to faction. For example, if you want to field ghouls and zombies, you'll be playing the Undead. But if you prefer zealots and flagellants, then the Witch Hunters are probably going to be your faction of choice. At the beginning of a campaign, each player gets 500 gold crowns to recruit fighters and buy all their gear, except for those snooty Marienburgers who get to start with 600 gold. Each faction has its own list of available weapons and armor, with each item having an associated cost. So a mercenary champion, for example, costs 35 gold to hire. If you buy him light armor, that's another 20. His first dagger is free, but a sword will set you back 10 gold. Then a helmet costs 10, and a buckler costs another 5. So all of a sudden, we've spent 80 gold on a single merc hero. We'll just have to hire some cheaper youngbloods and regular fighters to fill out the ranks and stay within our budget. Now, most weapons and armor have their own special rules in Mordheim. Swords can be used to parry, for instance. Hammers and maces can strike an enemy senseless. Spears allow the wielder to strike first. Heavy armor slows the wearer down, and helmets provide a special save against being stunned. In Mordheim, every model in a warband, except for those who fight with just claws and teeth, could potentially have different weapons and armor, which in turn will affect that figure's cost and its effectiveness on the battlefield. Once each player has recruited and equipped a warband, those gangs then compete with each other for riches and glory on the mean streets of Mordheim. Standard scenarios include missions like Defend the Find, Weirdstone Hunt, Street Fight, Chance Encounter, Hidden Treasure, and Surprise Attack. After every battle, each warband gets to roll on the exploration chart, which represents the gang searching the area afterwards in hopes of finding loot, weirdstone, or even magical artifacts. Gang members, most of them anyway, also accumulate experience during their violent careers, allowing them to buff their baseline stats and acquire new skills. In exchange for cold hard cash, the warband can also purchase new gear, hire new recruits, and even engage the services of powerful hired swords, further increasing its combat effectiveness. On the flip side, however, heroes may also acquire serious injuries during their adventures in Mordheim, which will stay with them for the rest of their days. So in a nutshell, Mordheim is a campaign-oriented skirmish miniatures game where competing warbands battle each other in the ruins of a comet-struck city some 500 years prior to the reign of Karl Franz in Warhammer Fantasy. One might even call it an RPG light, because individual warriors can gain experience, buff their stats, acquire skills, upgrade gear, and eventually even become mighty heroes of legend if they live long enough. In contrast, Warhammer Skirmish doesn't have mechanisms for gaining experience, finding treasure, and buying new gear. It's designed more for small-scale conflicts, using perhaps a dozen or so models per side from the regular Warhammer Fantasy line. So that's usually a game of about 100 to 200 points, give or take. Or as Games Workshop explained in the June 2002 issue of White Dwarf, Warhammer Skirmish is great for folks who don't have a lot of miniatures, a lot of time, and/or a lot of space. It's quite doable to play Warhammer Skirmish in about an hour on a kitchen table, using whatever figures you happen to have painted up. And while the skirmish rules don't really accommodate high-level heroes, spellcasters, flyers, or ethereal creatures very well, you can build a force using just about any regular troops from the 6th edition army lists, whereas the Mordheim gangs are built from their own designated faction lists. Also, tonally, Warhammer Skirmish is about skirmish warfare, perhaps an encounter between two scouting units that might affect a larger Warhammer battle somewhere else, where Mordheim is more about opportunists brawling in the streets so they can loot the surrounding neighborhood. As I said earlier, the Warhammer Skirmish rules are featured in the back of the Warhammer 6th edition rulebook, published in 2000, so about a year after the release of Mordheim. They are in Appendix 3, way in the back on page 242. Warhammer 6th edition was written by Rick Priestley and Thomas Pirinen, with Alessio Cavatore, Jake Thornton, and Nigel Stillman listed as game developers. And you may remember that Pirinen, Priestley, and Cavatore were all heavily involved in Mordheim, so it's not surprising that some of the Mordheim skirmish mechanics carried over to Warhammer 6th. Now to play Warhammer Skirmish, you're going to need army lists for whatever factions you're going to field, and that means either getting your hands on some 6th edition compatible army books, or the Warhammer Ravening Horde supplement, also published in 2000, which features 15 get-you-by army lists, which are basically just troop stats and that's it. If you want any of the additional fluff, lore, or info, then you need the full army books. Anyway, once you have the army list, you just use the point values for each troop type to build your skirmish force. Let's say you're playing a 200-point game, for example. A Dark Elf warrior with a hand weapon, light armor, and a shield will normally cost you 8 points. A city guard with a spear and light armor is 9 points, or 12 points if he has light armor, a hand weapon, and a repeating crossbow. Witch elves have 2 hand weapons and cost 11 points apiece, plus they have some special abilities. And I should point out that while swords, axes, and bludgeons confer special benefits in Mordheim, in Warhammer Skirmish, they're simply treated as hand weapons, though both games do have special rules regarding great weapons, flails, halberds, and spears. Okay, so Warhammer 6th edition was released in 2000. Then here we have the 2002 Warhammer Annual, which includes some very cool Warhammer Skirmish scenarios, as well as stats for the famed witch hunters Johann and Wilhelm. And then, of course, here is the 2002 Warhammer Skirmish Supplement, which features more than 20 skirmish scenarios, as well as suggestions for building components for some of these missions. We've played 3 of these scenarios on the channel already: Twilight of the Dead, Bring Out Your Dead, and Water Rights, and we hope to play more as time goes on. Warhammer Skirmish rules were also published on Games Workshop's website, along with a huge amount of supporting material, so again, Games Workshop was really pushing Skirmish back around 2002, which makes sense because the cost of building a full Warhammer army was so steep, they probably desperately needed some pathway to get beginners into the hobby. So remember White Dwarf 240 with the Mordheim reference sheet? Well, here is White Dwarf 269 from 2002, which contains a handy-dandy Warhammer Skirmish reference sheet, along with about 18 pages of Warhammer Skirmish content, some of which is also in the separate Warhammer Skirmish supplement. So in my mind, the big advantage to Warhammer Skirmish is you can use models from essentially any 6th edition Warhammer army list, as long as they don't have powerful abilities that kind of break the skirmish rules. So again, in reference to flyers, ethereals, powerful magic users and the like, I guess just use your common sense. Also, while Warhammer Skirmish does have its own specific rules, it also draws heavily on the 6th edition rank and flank rules, and sometimes those don't translate exactly. So for example, if a zombie can't march in Warhammer 6th, does that mean he can't run in Warhammer Skirmish? That question was posed to us since we had running zombies in one of our games. And since Warhammer 6th didn't provide a clear answer, I looked in the Mordheim rulebook, which definitely says zombies can't run, so we'll take that as canon. Which brings up an excellent point. I believe these two rule sets can absolutely work together. There is nothing stopping you from creating a custom warband using Warhammer Skirmish troops and dropping it into the city of Mordheim. Who's to say? Maybe the comet ripped a big hole in space-time. Okay folks, I could go on and on about this topic, but I think we'll call it good right here. Mordheim PDFs are readily available at broheim.net, and you can also find the Warhammer Skirmish rules online if you hunt around. I'm not sure if this is still a thing, but even a few years ago we used to find a lot of old Warhammer books at the used bookstore. We got our copy of Warhammer 6th edition for $2.95. And if you don't care about condition too much, you can also find things cheap on eBay and Amazon sometimes. And again, you don't have to buy all the codices to play Warhammer Skirmish. Ravening Hordes will get you by. So really all you need to play Warhammer Skirmish is this book, this supplement, and Ravening Hordes, and you should be good to go. And if you don't really need the hard copies, I think a lot of this is available online as unsanctioned PDFs. Thanks very much for dropping by today. December is going to be really crazy for us, but we have a couple things planned we hope to share with you during the holiday season. Until then, as always, please be careful out there. Try to get a game in if you can. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.